it's time for me to move on to what you're all gathered here for in the community of writers, and that is for us to have the presentation by Reverend Casteel Harper and Dr. Ryan Harper on writing, poetry, and justice. Thank you so much, both of you, for being our guests today.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Levine. What a generous introduction. You're always such a gracious host, and I just feel so warmly welcomed. Thank you to the Riverside Writing Group for having Ryan and I today join you. Of course, to Levine and Vernay and Maitri for extending this invitation. Of course, my esteemed and beloved colleague, Reverend Lamb. Thank you for being at the controls. Driving up the New Jersey Turnpike, one doesn't expect poetry to be the first thing you think of. And yet, as Ryan and I were driving up after our holidays, we were surprised to come across the Joyce Kilmer Service Plaza. And without skipping a beat, we said in near unison, "I think that I shall never see a poem lovely as a tree." Reciting the opening lines of Kilmer's most famous poem, Trees. Perhaps many of us memorized this poem as elementary school students, and we can say the last line together if you want to say it with me. Poems are made by fools like me, but only God can make a tree. So even if poetry may not be the most publicly prominent form of art in the United States, it certainly wafts in our cultural air to varying or lesser degrees that a New Jersey Turnpike service station was named after a poet perhaps proves the point. We all have different entry points into poetry. Maybe you embrace poetry and even see yourself as a poet. I look across the screen and I see poets in this room. But maybe you resist the label. Maybe you resist the genre altogether. Maybe poetry is equated with nursery school rhymes or elementary school memorization exercises, or it conjures up images of coffee house beatniks softly snapping with their berets on. Or maybe it's the slam poetry on the street corner. The poet and critic Alan Grossman says poetry is the principle is a principle of power invoked by all of us against our vanishing. It's a principle of power that resists death, that has to do with our very being and expressing our existence. It represents our desire to be known, to know, to be. And isn't justice also a power for life and against vanishing or death? Justice stands for life of the planet against its vanishing. Justice stands for life of the poor against their vanishing, life of Black people against their destruction. But often there's a real or imagined dichotomy between poetry and justice. While the two endeavors are valued as important in their own right, they are perhaps not imagined as deeply connected, and in fact may be seen as incongruous, or at least not readily related to one another. After all, justice is gritty.
Poetry is pretty.
Justice is action.
Poetry is words.
Justice is direct.
Poetry is elusive.
Justice is concrete.
Poetry is abstract.
Justice is fierce.
Poetry is gentle.
Justice protests.
Poetry plays.
Right? Right? So pick one. Either do justice or write poetry. But what if justice is both gritty and pretty? What if justice is both action and words, direct and elusive, concrete and abstract, fierce and gentle? What if justice both protests and plays?
What if poetry is both pretty and gritty, words and action, elusive and direct, abstract and concrete, gentle and fierce? What if poetry both plays and protests?
So in our time together, we'll explore what it might mean to write poetry and justice, to write justice poetically, to write poetry justly, to see writing as a form of justice, justice as a form of poetry. Ryan is a poet in the traditional sense, a writer of verse. So he will begin with the poetry vein. I am a creative nonfiction writer, not a verse poet. So I will end the presentation talking about the poetic in prose. We hope you feel invited in this space, that it's open and welcoming, and we hope invigorating conversation, especially on this day of Epiphany, meaning manifestation or illumination, and upon the first anniversary of what feels like the opposite of illumination, the insurrection. So I'll turn it over to Ryan now to take us deeper into reflecting on the intersection of poetry and justice.
Thanks, Lynn. And thanks to all of you for being here. It's such a kind of a sacred honor to get to be with people who value this work. And it's humbling to be invited to speak about it. Lynn mentioned the word conversation there at the end, and I want to say that we're going to be setting up, giving you a whole lot of material up front in the hopes that we're going to have a very lively conversation after we kind of collect this material and go in. So I'm going to be running through a few slides here. We're gonna look at a couple poems in my case, and Lynn's going to give you some artifacts of creative nonfiction, and hopefully at the end we'll have lots to talk about. Before we get there though, I'm going to share my screen, and I wanted to start with just a few quotations about truth, justice, beauty, art, and I'm gonna throw up a couple of them, and I'm gonna read them, sit on the slide about 5 seconds for us to absorb them, and see if maybe this just starts us thinking about some of the issues at hand when we're thinking about writing and justice. So hopefully everyone can see my slide now here. So let's start. Wisdom from across the disciplines in some ways. It is difficult to get the news from poems, yet men die miserably every day for lack of what is found there. William Carlos Williams. Justice is what love looks like in public. Cornel West. The need to let suffering speak is a condition of truth. Theodore Adorno. The poets, by which I mean all artists, are finally the only people who know the truth about us. Soldiers don't, statesmen don't, priests don't, union leaders don't. Only poets. James Baldwin. Truth is beauty, beauty, truth. John Keats. Beauty will save the world. Fyodor Dostoevsky. Beauty is about more rounded, substantial becoming. John O'Donohue. A poem invites a total response. Muriel Rukeyser. At the heart of the poem will be a question, a problem. And we will feel as we read a sense that the poet was not wed to any one outcome. Louise Glick. So a few things come up there, right? And I encourage you to reflect on those quotations. We might reject some, but when we try to find the truth embedded in all of them, however partial, it makes an interesting conversation, doesn't it? What is the relationship of art to beauty? What is the relationship of beauty to truth and truth-telling? What is truth-telling's relationship to justice, and what does that mean for justice's relationship to beauty and poetry? If justice involves truth-telling, what does it mean to say poetry might not be wed to any one outcome, that it's fairly provisional? Can poetry be open-ended yet committed? What does it mean to say art invites a total response, not just a rational argument intended to intellectually persuade? And for those of us who are writers in the room, we know that writing is often this intensely personal and sometimes private act. But if justice is what love looks like in public, how do we reconcile public writing with private writing, a private practice with a public practice? These are some things we might want to think about and revisit toward the end of our session today. So I want to just give two examples of poem. One's going to be mine, and then another is by another poet before I hand it over to Lynn, that I thought might be just good artifacts to consider as we think about these questions. We take a look at the choices two poets make. And again, thinking about these questions of what is possible in a poem when it comes to truth-telling, justice, and beauty. The first poet I'd like to talk about is someone some of you might know. Her name is Nikki Finney. Nikki Finney is an Affrilachian poet. If you don't know that term, the Affrilachian poets were a group of poets of color centered mostly in the Cumberland and Appalachian region. In Nikki Finney's case, South Carolina and Kentucky. She taught at the University of Kentucky for about 20 years. She now teaches at the University of South Carolina, wanting to problematize the notion of Southern, particularly Southern mountain culture, as predominantly white culture. So they're an interesting group if you're interested in them. Finney is one, Frank X. Walker is another one, Kelly Ellis. It's a big and growing group. I would even put, I don't know if she'd put herself there, but I can't help but think of Bell Hooks, who we recently lost in this vein as well. Someone who lived in the heart of Kentucky, right? And is thinking about justice, especially racial justice, in a place that's often caricatured as white. Finney won the National Book Award in 2011 for her collection of poems, Head Off and Split. She gave a very famous acceptance speech there that I would encourage you to find. John Lithgow, the actor who was present there, said, "It's not only the best acceptance speech ever given for a National Book Award, it's the best acceptance speech ever given by anyone for anything." High praise, right? So we're going to be reading a selection here, and it's on 3 slides, from her long poem, The Condoleezza Suite. Obviously reference to Condoleezza Rice, written in the heart and a little bit in the aftermath of the W. Bush administration, for which she served as Secretary of State. Let's take a look at what Nikki Finney does in this little section. I will mention too that there's some italics in here. These are all Finney's. I did not add any italics or anything like that. But let's just take a look and listen to this poem, take a look at it on these slides. The Condoleezza Suite, an excerpt. Concerto number 7, Condoleezza working out at the Watergate. Condoleezza rises at 4, stepping on the treadmill. Her long fingers brace the 2 slim handles of accommodating steel. She steadies her sleepy legs for the long day ahead. She doesn't get very far. Her knees buckle, wanting back last night's dream. Dream number 9. She is 15 and leaning forward from the bench, playing Mozart's piano concerto in D minor, alone, before the gawking, disbelieving, applauding crowd. Not dream number 2. She is 9 and not in the church that explodes into dust, the heart pine floor giving way beneath her friend Denise, rocketing her up into the air like a jack-in-the-box of a black girl wrapped in a Dixie cross. She ups the speed on the treadmill, remembering she has to be 3 times as good. Don't mix up your dreams, Condi. She runs faster, back to the right, finally hitting her stride. Mozart returns to her side. She is 15 again, all smiles, and relocated to the peaks of the Rocky Mountains, where she and the Steinway are the only Black people in the room. Condoleezza Rice, born in Birmingham, Alabama, would have been 9 years old when the 16th Street Baptist Church was bombed, lost a friend, relocated to the middle of Colorado. Also a concert pianist, also well-versed in that long, long history of people of color performing for white audiences. And Finney certainly had her many public performances for white audiences on mind when she wrote that line. I don't want to say too much because I want to hear other people's reactions toward the end of our session here, but let's think about what's going on here. An intensely specific and in some ways intimate portrait of someone whom in Finney's mind did some horrible, horrible things. What do we do with that? The last poem I want to talk about is mine, and I'm going to do something here today that I don't normally do. I'm going to speak at length about the making of this short poem that I'm going to be reading for you. So the occasion of this poem is Trump's inauguration in January 2017. Like many people at that time, I had a strong sense of dread about what was truly being inaugurated that day. I was also at that time a little mad at myself for having extended any sort of charity to white America. Before the Trump moment, I had thought that I had appropriately understood the limits of white American character development and the limitlessness of white American rage. But the Trump moment, and especially the inauguration, reminded me that I was still a good deal off the mark. My dread wasn't just about what the Trump regime was going to do or what horrible renewed license white America had granted to our own worst instincts. It was also dread about the incoming chaos, the kind of chaos that even its perpetrators, and maybe especially its perpetrators, had no equipment to predict, assess, or control. So on one hand, I had a feeling that Trump voters had no idea what kind of person they had really put at the wheel. Not just a guy who was wrongly moral, or not just immoral, but amoral. The type of person who was going to burn the world to the ground, his followers with it, to satisfy even one of his fleeting desires. But on the other hand, I had a sense that maybe Trump had no idea what kind of people he had courted to win the election. These are dissatisfied, despairing, violent, quick to anger people who actually knew a whole lot more about actual violence than Trump did, and who might well light him and his administration on fire to serve their own ends. And I don't just mean here the people who voted for him, but all those folks in his inner circle, the Bannons, the Stones, the Flynn's. None of these narcissists were interested in sharing power, I knew in 2017. They were going to eat each other if they needed to. This was kind of comforting, but also kind of terrifying to think about. And of course, behind all of this, I was thinking about everyone else. Who were we? Were we a we in any real sense? Had we done anything wrong? And what were we prepared to do given the chaos that was coming? So there were tons of Trump poems already in the air at this point, and there would be more for sure. And I certainly understood the impulse to write a Trump poem. I felt the need to write one too. And indeed, I wrote a ton of lines in my journal working this out, right? This was kind of necessary soul work, but also necessary for my drafting process. And I would emphasize that point, right? There is nothing that's not worth writing down. Everything is worth writing. But the question of what the poem out loud would be, what would be, if anything, my public contribution, the finished product that everyone laid eyes on? Well, that's a different question. So I did some thinking, I did some reading, and I made some decisions. I decided that I was going to try to write something more broadly true about my little parochial American moment than anything that was specifically false about it. So to do this, I needed to start connecting to some broader traditions and stories and to back off the specific occasion for a moment that catalyzed all of these thoughts, that Trump moment. So as I plumbed my dread, and as I bracketed off my dislike for the particular characters in the Trump moment, I kept going back to this notion of people playing fast and loose with powers they think they control, but which they don't understand. This species of entitlement and privilege. It seems like that's something that's always been going on, right? There's something true about that, and there's something really important to name about that. So my mind went back to some of those old stories and myths that go through that stuff. The myth of Narcissus, the myth of Pandora's box, the Frankenstein story. And I kept particularly going back to those East Asian legends about encounters between people and dangerous animals, usually big jungle cats, often kept as pets. Actually, these are sometimes real. If any of you are interested, look up the Tiger Temple in Thailand, and you can see maybe an example of this. I also reread Philip Levine's poem, They Feed, They Lion, which is this ominous piece which he wrote as an industrial worker in Detroit. I started thinking about rhythms and sounds, sometimes taking myself through an exercise of enunciating consonants and reciting syllables in rhythm to see if any of just the sounds themselves sort of spoke to the feeling I was experiencing and what I wanted my readers to experience. Hissing S's, hard C's and K's consonants, the da 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 flowing lines that then stopped hard. All of that was on my mind. So the poem came out of all that. And in a literal sense, this poem is really just about a person of privilege playing with what he thought was his pet lion. So you'll notice that the poem occurs you'll notice a few things about it, but I only give one clue right up front in the epigraph that it's even about the Trump moment. Maybe some little cues in the poem itself. This is called Panthera. Washington, D.C., January 2017. They said he had been playing with the lion again. Tussle, long cravat and tail, before the wide mouth, rolling in the open court, someone's toy, growling and growling back, playing alpha, playing king. They, lion, a full jowl, in the main a golden thing. But the mimic alone chasing likeness falls headlong into his game, alone in the roar of singularity, lost when the objects change. Witnesses would have heard claw and cuff screech against marble. What possesses a man that he lionize himself before his animal? What came over him when the animal began to play fair? So you'll notice here some confusion of identity. If you try to map the specific American characters onto the story, who's Trump, the supporters, the inner circle, you'll notice it's not immediately clear how to do so. Who's the lion? Who's the person? And again, this speaks to my sense of not really knowing in real life who's playing with whom here, right? I don't usually like ending my poems with question marks, but I felt like it was also appropriate for this one, given this feeling of confusion that was kind of at the root of my dread. Is it a Trump poem? Is it a justice poem? I mean, let me close by saying a word about what I feel like I sacrificed as I made the choices I did here, and how actually the poem falls short by some metrics. I don't think I've ever written something that I felt succeeded in every sense, was complete in every way. I think one critique that could be made of my poem here is that it's too removed from the occasion of its inspiration. I mean, for instance, imagine for a second, we just read this and I haven't given you all the background information on it, right? Maybe you would have put some pieces together, but it might have taken some more labor. One of my rules about writing poetry tends to I don't want to do too much labor for my readers. I don't want to hold readers' hands. And I stand by that rule. But one of my faults and one of the opportunity costs of that is that sometimes I don't provide enough steerage. That's related to this question of justice, and it's a more serious point, because read a certain way, this poem could be a kind of justice dodge. I mean, you ask great community organizers, great freedom fighters, great advocates of justice and for justice, they know that effective protest is always particular. It's always pointed protest. Truth is specific, and truth-telling often requires naming names, calling roll, pointing out specific injustices. Think of the Hebrew prophets here, right? All of those names that confuse us when we read them, it's because the prophets are specifically calling people out. So this piece, my piece, could be criticized for not being prophetically specific. I take that charge seriously, by the way, because I'm a white liberal man. And I think it's a strong temptation for people in my demographic to unfortunately be content with that sort of justice work. We're generally committed, we're vaguely concerned, but do we ever get down in the muck, the weeds, the serious specific work where real reconciliation, real justice work is happening? When one retreats to generalities, one can lose some of that, and one can also dishonor the specific victims of injustice involved in their specific struggles. I mean, this is one of the reasons the say her name, say his name part of the BLM movement is so important. Breonna Taylor, George Floyd. And these are not just lives in general that are lost. These are specific, precious lives that have to be counted in all of their beautiful specificity. So there's lots more to say on that issue, and I could offer more defenses of my choices and stuff, but I do basically just wanted to give you a sense of my dilemma as a writer, working out this notion of what it means to write and think about justice. I'm always trying to reconcile and place into dialogue the particular and the general, and trying to maneuver across time and space from my own particular time and space. I'll say one thing about this particular poem. You know, this comes from this specific moment, right? And one benefit of the fact that I chose to stand outside it a little bit in the poem was that 4 years later, this happened. And when I revisited my poem, Panthera, in light of this thing, I was strangely comforted, because it was almost as if the stuff I had written 4 years earlier about chaos and power and the lack of control was playing out before my eyes in 2021. So that was the benefit. In some ways, it rang still true, and maybe more true those years later. That's probably enough for now. I'd like to hand it over to Lynn, who's going to, in her very elegant way, transition us out of poetry as verse and to think about poetry as creative nonfiction.
Thank you, Ryan. So yes, we move from verse to prose, from verse to sentences and paragraphs, and maybe some in this room today are more comfortable there in the expository writing like I am. So when we enter the house of prose, I like us to think of not leaving poetry at the door. that we enter in with poetry as a companion. So what distinguishes creative nonfiction writing, at least in my book, in my estimation, or if we want to call it the essay form, is that it combines the journalistic with the poetic. And then we have creative nonfiction. So just to bring us into that a little bit more, I look at Vivian Gornick, who's a wonderful essayist. She says that what happens to the writer is not what matters. What matters is the large sense that the writer is able to make of what happened. So if we think of the journalistic as almost like a timeline, the creative nonfiction is like a collage. So if the journalistic is a timeline of truth, the creative nonfiction is a collage of truth. So rather than reporting events or making a straightforward argument of a particular viewpoint or advocating for a particular policy or practice, creative nonfiction, or the essay, uses carefully selected images, allusions, stories, metaphors that invite, provoke, and gesture. Invite, provoke, and gesture more than they correct, defend, or pronounce. So there's an emphasis on the poetic in prose in creative nonfiction, an emphasis on shaping and uncovering truths rather than providing necessarily just pure information or directives. The writer is always involved and never exempted from the struggle toward truth, toward this uncovering, toward this provoking and inviting and gesturing. So the writer, in my view, is not omniscient, is not standing from a place of certainty, but is deeply involved in the struggle. And so we look at Elizabeth Hardwick, who is another masterful essayist. And she says this: the mastery of expository prose, the rhythm of sentences, the pacing, the sudden flash of unexpected vocabulary redeem polemic. Writing justice with poetic prose resists the diatribe. And it is the poetic that helps us resist the polemic. So rather, writing justice with poetic prose seeks to combine the strong, straightforward, and searing. So I don't want you to hear me say, because it's not a polemic or diatribe, that it's not strong, straightforward, and searing at times, combined with the compassionate, open, and vulnerable. So it's a delicate dance indeed. It's both and, not either or. Strong, straightforward, and searing, and compassionate, open, and vulnerable. The writer of poetic prose is part of the struggle, not exempt, not a guide, not a distant guide who imparts their truth from on high, from a place of perfection, completion, or absolute certainty, but rather seeks to uncover, elucidate, offer up, inviting readers on a journey of discovery and humanity and truth, rather than offering a tidy package of facts or erudite arguments. And as I say, if the journalistic provides a timeline of truth, the poetic prose provides a collage of truth. Both styles are rooted in veracity, but choose to organize and tell the truth in different ways. So I'm not trying to create a hierarchy here. Certainly we need journalism of integrity, absolutely. And journalism can be highly artful. But I thought maybe we could look at a few examples of ways we can apply the poetic to prose, just to give us, kind of fire up our engines a little. And I know we don't have tons of time, but let's look at something like the AIDS crisis. And there's so many overlapping justice issues we could look at here. This first little section is what I'd call more journalistic. So if you don't mind, I'll just quickly read that. AIDS is a global phenomenon. Its ravages known everywhere. The international death toll peaked in 2014 with 1.7 million people lost their lives after becoming infected with HIV. In the United States, at its deadliest, HIV/AIDS claimed the lives of 50,000 Americans in a single year. Today, thanks to antiretroviral therapy, many more people are able to live with AIDS, but no vaccine has been successfully developed, and somewhere between 1.4 million and 2.3 million people around the world become newly infected every year. Yet there are places and communities that suffer the plague of AIDS especially, and so early on that they came to symbolize its mystifying passage from a seemingly local problem of uncertain origin, affecting only a small number of people, to a vast conflagration of disease taking the lives of millions. San Francisco is one such place, making its experience especially valuable to the larger story of how Americans and others rose, albeit slowly and with many a human flaw, to fight the scourge of a new disease. And so we have some really nice journalistic writing here from David Skinner in his article, AIDS in One City, the San Francisco Story from Humanities Journal. So what would happen if the journalistic meets the poetic? And so the next slide, I'm going to show a piece of creative nonfiction writing. And this is from Richard Rodriguez's Late Victorians, Harper's Magazine, October 1990. It also appears in his book, Days of Obligation, An Argument with My Mexican Father. For those of you who don't know Richard Rodriguez, he's a preeminent American essayist of Mexican descent, a committed and traditional Roman Catholic who is openly gay. Rodriguez occupies a space of tension. This piece, Late Victorians, Rodriguez, who's a San Franciscan, struggles with the death of his friends, the disappearing of a landscape of friendship. And he does so looking at the human and architectural landscape of the city, issues of faith, sin, and redemption. What does it mean to do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with God amidst this landscape in San Francisco in the 1980s and 90s? And so this is, we looked at the journalistic, let's look at the prose, the poetic prose. And this kind of gets me every time, but I have seen people caressing it, staring death down. I have seen people wipe its tears, wipe its ass. I have seen people kiss death on his lips where once there were lips. Sometimes no family came, or parents came but then left without reconciliation, some preferring to say cancer. But others came. They walked death's dog. They washed his dishes. They bought his groceries. They massaged his poor back. They changed his bandages. They emptied his bedpan. The saints of this city have names listed in the phone book, names I heard called through a microphone one cold Sunday in Advent as I sat in Most Holy Redeemer Church, at a time in the history of the world when the Roman Catholic Church pronounced the homosexual a sinner. A woman at the microphone called upon the volunteers from the AIDS support group to come forward. Throughout the church, people stood up. A lady with a plastic candy cane pinned to her lapel, a Castro clone with a red bandana exploding from his hip pocket, a perfumed counter lady with a Hermes scarf mantled upon her shoulder, a black man in a checkered sports coat, the pink-haired punkus with a jewel in her nose. Here, too, is the gay couple in middle age, interchangeable plaid shirts and corduroy pants, blood and shit and Mr. Happy Face. These know the weight of bodies. These learned to love what is corruptible, while I, barren skeptic, reader of St. Augustine, I shift my tailbone upon the cold, hard pew. Whew. So we see here the poetic brought powerfully to prose. We see the personification, the person dying personified as death, care partners as companions to death. We see saints in the Roman Catholic tradition reoriented. They're not in the stained glass. They're standing up from their pews. They're the pink, I love that, the pink-haired punkus with a jewel in her nose, the alliteration. The writer who has lost friends, including a dear friend and possibly a lover, Caesar, implicates himself at the end, his tailbone upon the pew. So he's not finger wagging from on high. Justice comes very close, the demands. And it leaves us, this is the closing line of his essay, and it leaves us asking, are you standing up? Am I standing up? And so this is just one example I wanted to share. And I know we're Levine, we're probably close to ending here. I had one more example.
I'm for it. Are you kidding? After that powerful, I think, to use Dr. Harper Ryan's words, sacred.
Whew, whew. Well, this the next one, it can't go, Ryan. What?
I was going to say, don't get out of this. The next one is her piece.
All right. We'll move along, but I do want to hear from others. The example too is from my own writing, and this is about a different subject of justice, dementism, the prejudice against those people living with dementia. And I wanted to show some journalistic writing that I've done and then pair it with some perhaps more poetic prose. And so the journalistic writing is pretty straightforward. I don't even know if I necessarily, I'll just read a few of the sentences. But bioethicist Stephen Post uses the term dementism to describe the prejudice against the deeply forgetful. Dementism reflects a deep cultural sickness that combines a bias against old age, ageism, with a bias against impaired cognition, cognitivism. The result is a highly pessimistic and reductionistic attitude towards people living with dementia. They are their disease. They are shells, husks, the living dead. They can have no quality of life. The disease is the death that leaves the body behind, which feeds the notion that dementia creates a category of subhumans, not unlike zombies. And so I'll stop there for a minute, but you get the sense that I'm being pretty straightforward. I don't know if it's necessarily polemic, but it's in a journalistic style. So the next, so what happens when the journalistic meets the poetic? In my book, I talk about a woman named Victoria. Victoria, before this section, I have kind of dismissed her, and dementism within me and within my institution had dismissed her as sort of what we call pleasantly confused, and didn't necessarily take her very seriously. So right before this section, I'm critiquing an institutional model that often dismisses people with dementia. So I provide kind of this broad sort of public critique and then come back to kind of myself. And so this is a Maundy Thursday service, which is traditionally a foot washing. I know at Riverside we have that. And so we would do this at the nursing home where I worked. We would do a foot washing, but it wasn't feet, it was hands, because that was easier to access. And so we would, the Catholic sister would run the service, and she invited me to come every year. And Victoria was at the service, someone we had sort of all dismissed as not wholly there. And so Sister approached Victoria and extended her palms to show her what to do. Victoria mirrored her, cupping her hands. I bent forward with the bowl as Sister Donna poured the water and offered a blessing. May God's Spirit refresh you. May you know Jesus' unconditional love and share this love with all those who you meet. As the water covered Victoria's hands, I observed her face transform from what I had deemed benign but unfocused to utter intent attention. Her features slackened and broadened, tense lines around her eyes softened, lines I had never noticed until they had disappeared. Her sobs sprung from, her cheeks flushed, and her strong frame shook as she began to softly weep. Her sobs sprung from a center, tender, solid, and sure. For once I saw her roundly, as a person in dynamic motion, circling an inevitable cause. Victoria drew me in within the orbit of her exquisite core and spun me back out again, converted. I saw beyond my surface vision. The air cleared and the clouds lifted a little, apprising me of a new and excellent region of life, hers, mine. In my small vessel, I received the streams that ran from her flesh. She remembered all who she is. Sister commented to me after the service with her usual spiritual astuteness. I remembered too.